Welcome to Faith Focals. My name is Faith. I have been uncharacteristically gone for 2 weeks. I had given some warning at the end of my last video that I would be absent. I didn't know when I would be absent. I didn't expect it to take me 2 weeks, but the event that I was thinking would happen did happen. So that took me away from my usual routine for a bit. Now I'm back. Now we're back to the usual routine, which is we've been going through the book of Genesis, and I've been talking, kind of giving my reaction to what the Bible says, giving my understanding of the very different culture of the ancient world in which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived. And the last story that the last account that we saw was about Judah. Judah had a really tangled kind of story going on. Of course, Judah was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he was actually the son that I believe he suggested to the brothers that they sell Joseph, their younger brother. They didn't care for him much, that they sell him into slavery. They were going to murder him. And Reuben, the oldest, here, I've got it up on the screen here. So Reuben, the oldest, said to the brothers, let's not kill him, let's throw him into the pit, because he wanted to rescue Joseph, but then he left the scene for whatever reason. The Bible doesn't really say why. They threw Joseph into a pit while they were far away from Jacob, so they couldn't be caught for this event. And then when a slave caravan came on their way to Egypt, Judah suggested, let's not just leave him in the pit, let's go ahead and sell him to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and they'll take him to Egypt. So Judah was the one responsible for that. We'll go to full screen again for a moment, and I'll get set up for our session today. But last time we were here, 2 weeks ago, last time we had one of these sessions, Judah, in brief, I'm going to summarize in brief, which is difficult because the ancient culture is very difficult from ours. They have something they call a levirate marriage. And the idea is that if you have one brother who marries a wife and he dies before she's able to give him children, then the next youngest brother needs to marry the older brother's wife, the deceased brother's wife. And the child that she bears to the younger brother is going to be counted as the offspring of the older brother, so that the older brother can have someone to carry his name even though he's no longer around and did not directly biologically father that son. The son will still be in the name of the older, now deceased brother. So that's kind of unusual, not the way that we usually tend to think of passing down a father's name. We tend to associate that name with the DNA of the father being part of the child. But last time we spoke, Judah was in a situation where his oldest son married this gal named Tamar, and she could not give him children before he died because he was wicked. The Lord punished him for his wickedness by killing him. So she had not been able to give him children. So now she needed to marry the next brother and be able to give her former husband those children. The next brother didn't like that, so he was not allowing her to get pregnant and have children, and I'm putting that lightly. So the Lord killed him because God wasn't happy that the second son was not fulfilling the levirate marriage for the older brother. So then she had to marry the next son, but Judah says, my next son is too young. How about you go and live like a widow in your father's house, and when he's old enough, then I'll arrange for you two to get married. Except he didn't. And also, at some point, he went to a kind of a feast event, sheep shearing. They were expecting prophet to come in from the sale of the wool, or maybe they would use the wool of the sheep themselves. But this was a festive time, and so while Judah was Tamar's father-in-law, while Judah was getting ready to celebrate, he sought out the services of a prostitute. Little did he know that that prostitute was actually Tamar, who had heard that he would be on the road, and she knew that he had not given her her promised husband, even though the youngest son was now old enough to marry her. And so she had intended to intercept him and be able to get the right to bear children that she was due, if not from the next son, the way that it should have worked, then she was at least going to get it from the father, from Judah, her father-in-law. So then it was, she kept this a secret, that she had this relation with Judah. Judah had no idea. She'd had her face veiled. He didn't realize that she was the prostitute he'd had the relationship with, until later on it was discovered that she was pregnant, and he, not knowing, said that she ought to be punished. She ought to be burned at the stake for being unfaithful to the youngest son and unfaithful to the name of her former husband. And she sent him proof that she had actually prostituted herself with Judah. So Judah wound up saying, she's actually more righteous than I am, since I did not fulfill my end of the bargain by giving the next son to her in the sense of this levirate marriage. So a very very confusing kind of story given our culture, the Western culture. Maybe if you come from a culture that's a little closer to theirs, then you can understand where they're coming from. And I'm always looking for input from folks watching the videos. I'd love to see your comments down below. So that was the last account that we did in brief. And I bring it up again because I think it's going to be interesting to kind of contrast it a little bit with what we're going to cover today. I want to see if I can cover a lot of ground today. Today we are going to Genesis chapter 39, and this is, we are returning to the story of Joseph. So as I said earlier, we saw where Joseph's brothers sold him as a slave, being sent to Egypt. And then the Bible takes a break and tells us this account about Judah. And now we are finally going to see what happened to Joseph. So I mentioned the last time, I'm trying to pull up the Bible screen here. I mentioned the in the last video that I suspect that a lot of time was passing for Joseph over the time that Judah's story was happening, because Tamar goes through 3 sons, and the youngest son grows to be of age to marry during the time of Judah's story. Now, I think this story about Joseph is happening concurrently. The Ishmaelites, the Midianites buy him from his brothers, and then they head on their way to Egypt. And when they arrive at Egypt, that's where our account begins here. So it tells, we see, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So the Bible's very specific about Potiphar's identity. There's no questioning which Potiphar the Bible might be discussing here and what his lineage might have been. So this particular person buys Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all he had in the house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And this story kind of reminds me a little bit. We had an account earlier about Joseph's father, Jacob. Back when Jacob was fleeing his brother Esau, he had betrayed Esau on a couple of occasions and had deceived Jacob's father, Isaac, into giving Jacob the blessing that Isaac intended for Esau. And it was a nice blessing. He was setting the recipient of that blessing up to be over the rest of the family, including his brother. And the recipient would benefit from the wealth of the land. So that blessing wound up going to Jacob instead of Esau. Esau was very angry with this, to say the least. I intended to kill Jacob when Isaac was no longer alive. Jacob heard of this and fled with his mother's support. His mother said, "Go find my brother Laban. He lives up north in Haran, and go to him, marry one of his daughters, and I will let you know when it's safe to come back." It was the Lord who wound up letting him know that it was safe to come back. I suspect that Rebecca, Jacob's mother, probably passed away before she was able to let him know that all was well. So for a long time, for about 20 years, Jacob stayed with Laban, and his arrangement was he had fallen in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and he said, "Tell you what, I'll work for you 7 years if I can marry your daughter Rachel." And so he worked for Laban 7 years and was going to marry Rachel, but Laban pulled a switcheroo. Another instance with a veil, I imagine. The Bible doesn't say that his bride was veiled, but we might well imagine that she was, especially since Jacob didn't know until after the fact that he was marrying Rachel's sister Leah instead, who he didn't fall in love with. He was in love with Rachel. So in order to get Rachel, he said, "I'll work for another 7 years." And Laban gave him Rachel as his second wife, and then Jacob worked another 7 years. And over that time, the two wives and the handmaids who came with them, so concubines to Jacob, were providing him with children. And let's see, so over this time, yes, I had to remember where I was connecting here. I knew it was around in that area. After the 7 years of working off for Rachel, who he actually got to marry, then Jacob said, "Laban, how about I work for you 7 years more, and we'll make an arrangement that I can keep any spotted sheep that are born to you, and you'll keep any white sheep that are born to you, and it'll be clear whose sheep are whose." And it seemed like a great plan. Jacob was invested in helping the sheep to bear healthy offspring, and the Lord, Jacob wasn't in charge of what color the sheep were going to be, but the Lord did arrange for the sheep to bear spotted very often. Even though Laban had taken all of the spotted sheep away so that Jacob should not have had the good results that he did. Clearly this was an act of God. And so God was blessing Jacob with success there. Now the reason Laban had agreed to that agreement, to that plan, was he had actually gone, I'm sorry, I'm getting it mixed up. After Jacob worked 7 years for what wound up being Leah. He worked 7 years after marrying Rachel. And then it was Laban. I better go back and just make sure that I've got this right here. And we'll kind of aim for the general vicinity of this account. I think it's around in this neighborhood. Okay, so now here's how it goes. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination," and I think that that this word divination could also mean experience, observation. We'll just have a quick peek at the original Hebrew here. let's see. So I have divined here, so we'll have a look at what that means. There are some aspects where it could refer to enchantment, fortune telling, but also it could refer to learned by experience, diligently observed. So it's possible that Laban was practicing divination, signs and omens, that kind of thing. I also wonder if he's not just saying, look, I can clearly tell from observation, from experience, that the Lord is blessing me because of you. So this is the verse that we were just at. I'll go back to our original reference. So if you're a expert in Hebrew and you know better than me how that wording works and in which sense that wording works, I would love to hear your input. So he says, I have learned that the Lord has blessed me because of you. I think the reason I come to that conclusion, let me just go ahead and check one thing. I tend to read in the King James Version when I'm preparing for these studies. So when I had been reading in the King James Version, this is the English Standard Version that we're in for the main text, and then this is something that we can use to compare different versions. But the King James says, I have learned by experience. So that's why I have the idea that I have about this. Clearly, because the Hebrew doesn't translate one-to-one for English, when you're trying to translate from one language to another, sometimes you have to use your best judgment for in interpreting it. And so I think the English Standard Version tries to be very careful that they're giving the correct sense. I think the translators of the King James back in 1611 were doing their best to do the same. We've got two different senses, and so we've got two different versions, and so we understand we have a fuller information with both of those versions about what this verse could possibly mean than if we had only one version that we were limited to. If we only had the learning by experience or version, or if we only had the divination version, then there wouldn't be, I wouldn't have the understanding that, oh, it could be held in this other respect. So I just say that I know that for some people who are not Christians, it's confusing. Okay, which version of the Bible is actually the accurate one? And the accurate version of the Bible is the original Hebrew and Greek that the Bible was actually written in. The issue with that is that we don't really have the original copies that the Bible was written in. We have scribal copies. In other words, people handwrote copies of the originals. And so we have fragments or editions of those scribal copies, and sometimes things change. And as I say, between different versions, people may make different decisions regarding translating certain words like this. So it does get confusing from the outside looking in. Okay, which version, if you were interested in investigating, would you want to pick up and start reading? And the way that I approach this as I'm trying to learn the Bible and I'm trying to understand the truth of the word that God gave us, I recognize that there are these differences. And so I try to be aware of a multitude of versions. So like I recognize in the English Standard Version, okay, this one says divination. In the King James Version, that one says by experience. And then I try to be, I try to look for which tends to be the most accepted version. And the King James Version is also called I don't remember exactly the standard version. So the English Standard Version here, the reason the word standard there is because the English Standard Version actually tries to to line up with the King James Version if there's a discrepancy. So there was a specific reason they chose a different word here, but normally they would try to line up with the King James Version. There's another version of the Bible called the American Standard Version. So again, another English version, newer than the King James, and where there's a question, it tries to line up alongside the King James, because the King James is the standard version of the Bible also, and that's because the King James is recognized to be a pretty reliable translation. So a lot of the time I would err on the side of assuming that the King James translation is right if I have no other information about any question about it. So that was a long rabbit trail and over a little molehill. So we have this Laban is telling Jacob, I'm seeing that God is blessing me because of you. Name your wages and I will give it. And that's why Jacob wound up working the last 6 years for Laban, except the Lord was actually blessing Jacob, not necessarily Laban, as Laban found when all of his goats kept sheep and goats kept breeding spotted or mottled instead of the white sheep that he was hoping. Now Jacob was receiving the offspring as his wealth, as Laban had agreed to, and Laban was not very happy with that arrangement. And now we'll go back to the account we're at, because the similarity I saw there was that we also have Potiphar looking at what Joseph's doing, how Joseph is ruling the household, and he's going, I'm well off because Joseph is in charge. And so the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all he had in house and field. So now he elevates Joseph, just like Laban was saying to Jacob, okay, you've been taking care of my sheep pretty well, and I'll let you keep doing that for another 6 years. So Potiphar is elevating Joseph in power in his household, so that he had no concern about anything except the food he ate. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. So his wife is probably impressed with how Joseph rules the household too. Definitely notices that Joseph is handsome in form and appearance, and starts making this proposal to him. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. Now, maybe you'd think that that would be an argument for getting to do whatever he wants with the master's wife, right? But I think he looks at this right. He said, he is not greater in this house than I am, which is interesting, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He's saying, listen, I owe a great debt of gratitude to my master, because he has allowed me to have even as much power in this house as he has, because I'm here to manage his goods. The only thing I don't manage is you, and so it would be a slight against him. It would be a slight against God if I were to take you up on your proposal. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. So nowadays we would call this workplace sexual harassment. Of course, he had a different relationship. He was not being paid for his work. He was a slave, which kind of puts him in a worse place, right? Because he doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on, but he's still faithful to his integrity, and he will not fool around with his master's wife. He's not married to her, and God doesn't condone what the Bible would call sexual immorality. So that would be sexual relations outside of marriage. And Joseph, I think, did a better job than, say, his brother Judah. That's why I went over the Judah story, because we see that Judah chose to fool around with a prostitute, not knowing that it was his daughter-in-law Tamar. And as it turns out, the only thing that Tamar did that was opposed to God's will in that situation was she did not wait to be married to Judah. She did do sexual immorality by biblical standards. She should have been married in order to have that relation. It would be easy to see her justification in human terms. Her saying, well, I've been promised the right to children in the name of my first husband, and that promise is being denied to me. And I think it's interesting the way that she approached the situation. The word took advantage is probably an accurate word. I think, and I hesitate because, again, Judah is saying that she is the more righteous person in the scenario, and I think he saw it rightly, but at the same time, they were both in sin by biblical standards. But the way that she approached that, it was up to him to actually follow through with the sin. So I'm not saying that she was justified in the way that she went about it. I think she would be more righteous to say, Lord, apparently you did not give me the youngest son. Apparently you did not give me the right to have children, and this would not be your will. She instead sought what she understood to be justice. She took advantage of Judah's weakness. Judah sought out the services of a prostitute when one was available to him. And then by that act of immorality, then she actually got the justice that she was seeking. And interestingly also, as I mentioned in the last video, that act, her seeking justice through that relation with Judah, God allowed Tamar to become a part of the lineage, not only of Jacob, whose name, he had another name, Israel, that was given to him by God, and Israel became the name of the nation that was Jacob's offspring. And so Tamar got to be a part of that lineage of Israel. She got to mother the tribe of Judah. But also, she was an ancestress of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Jesus has a lot of ancestors. In fact, all of Jesus' ancestors had sin. Quite a number of them, I'm sure, had their scandals, including Judah himself. So, interestingly, Tamar gets to be a part of a line, and we'd consider her blessed that she had the privilege of being a part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Now, we're seeing in this instance, Joseph is demonstrating more integrity than Judah did. We're not seeing sin at this point with Joseph. He is holding himself apart from Potiphar's wife, even though she keeps badgering him to lie with her. He's committed to his integrity, and he's going to say no. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. So I was wondering about this word garment here, just kind of know, okay, how intense was this struggle? What kind of garment is he leaving behind? And I find here that the word garment is kind of generic, used indiscriminately, it says. So the way I understand this, treachery, deceit, I think it comes from the sense of covering. So treachery might be also hiding. I'm not quite sure what the connection is, but that's the way I understand it. But this garment would be a covering also, so that seems like the common concept. We get a little more detail about the word garment here. Robe of any kind, from the filthy clothing of the leper to the holy robes of the high priest. So it doesn't matter what kind of clothing it is. I think I saw somewhere, I'm trying to see, I thought I saw somewhere that it was like the outer clothing. Here's probably where it is. A garment, usually the outer garment of the Oriental. So this source that they're using, Gesenius's Hebrew Chaldee lexicon, is an older source. So we might say Asian, where this one says Oriental. So someone from the East. So that's where I'm getting the sense that it might have been an outer garment. Still wouldn't want to be something that you'd leave behind. Still obviously leaves enough question about what was going on. So he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in with me, to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment behind me and fled and got out of the house." So when I saw this, I was curious about the wording here. I think when she says, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us," I think she's referring to her husband. That would be the word he here. So she's referring to Potiphar, which it makes sense. She probably has some tension against Potiphar, probably is not having a good relationship with Potiphar. That's why she's seeking out this relationship with a slave boy, right? So, and I imagine even if they had a good relation up until this point, if Potiphar had any sense of her fooling around, it wouldn't stay good for long. But I don't see her trying to protect Potiphar. I see a little attack at Potiphar with this accusation, which is truly false. Joseph did not try to lie with her. He's been fighting it all this time. I thought it was interesting, the word Hebrew here, because we have in the book of Genesis, we of course start with Adam and Eve, and they have their only surviving son is Seth, and then the descendant of Seth that we focus on next is Noah, and Noah has 3 sons, Ham, Ham, and Japheth. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is the ancestor of what turns out to be Abraham. Abraham is the patriarch of Israel, but he also is a patriarch of other nations, such as the Ishmaelites, such as, there's several different nations that come from Abraham's bloodline. So the next step down is Isaac, Abraham's promised son. God promised Abraham the son Isaac, and Isaac was also the father of an extra nation besides the nation of Israel. That would be Esau's line. Esau was the father of the Edomites, so that became a powerful nation. And then the next step down from Isaac is Jacob, and Jacob, as I've mentioned, received the name Israel from God. And so now Jacob's offspring are the Israelites. And so we don't see anywhere in that line this word Hebrew. And yet this Egyptian lady says, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." So I wanted to see what that word means. And I find that the word Hebrew, Ibri, I don't know if you actually roll that R or not, but I just did, means one from beyond. So I guess it has the sense of being a foreigner. That's the sense that I would ascribe to it. We have one reference before this one. This is our verse here. But one reference before this, and this is from when Abraham moved into the land of Canaan, as God told him to do. Abraham settled at a location called the Oaks of Mamre, and Mamre was a local Canaanite. He was an Amorite. That was a group among the Canaanites. So Mamre had a property. There were these oaks. I guess he allowed Abraham to stay by these oaks, to set up camp by these oaks. So Abraham became friends with Mamre, and Mamre had a couple brothers. Abraham's nephew Lot separated from Abraham. Lot had come down with Abraham into Canaan, and then Lot split off because they both had a lot of sheep, a lot of livestock, and the land couldn't support all of that livestock together, so they had to separate. And then later on, these nations from outside, like I think 5 kings from afar, came and attacked the region and took Lot captive. And in this chapter here, Genesis 14, it tells of how Abram joined forces with his friend Mamre and Eshcol and Aner, and they went to go and rescue Lot. These Abraham had like 318 people, men of fighting age in his camp. He took those. I don't know what Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner contributed to the battle, but they also went, and they wound up defeating these 5 foreign kings and rescuing Lot and all the other prisoners. So I see here we have Mamre is said to be an Amorite. Eshcol and Aner, we can assume, are Amorites, being his brothers. And Abram is the Hebrew. So that's where Abram comes from. Abram is the one from beyond. So in other words, this verse is emphasizing that Abram doesn't belong there. Abram is a foreigner. And yet he's got these friends who are natives. They're Amorites. They belong to the region. And they're willing to help him to rescue his nephew. So now, in this sense here, we tend to recognize nowadays that the word Hebrew is synonymous with the word Israelite, especially to those of us who are familiar with the Bible. We see the two as the same thing. You can call them Hebrews, you can call them Israelites. Towards the latter half of the Bible, we see the word Jews being used. So they all represent the same group of people. But I feel like this sense is a little bit different, the way that she's using the word. She's not pointing out a specific group of people, because Israel is not a part of a Hebrew people as a group. We see Abraham is called a Hebrew. I think that's in the sense of he is from beyond. He is a foreigner who has settled where he has settled. And so naturally his son Isaac would be a Hebrew, in the sense one from beyond who's settled. He doesn't actually belong where he is. And Jacob would be one from beyond who has settled where he doesn't actually belong. Now God has promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that their offspring would rule over the land of Canaan, but that has not happened just yet. And now we're seeing Joseph, who is definitely far afield of where he belongs. Perhaps one could say Jacob has become settled in the land of Canaan and is like the people groups there, like perhaps the inhabitants of the city of Shechem, which Jacob got to stay in for a little while, and then his sons ruined that for him. But Joseph now has come from afar to Egypt. And so I think she's slighting Joseph here too, basically. She's saying, see, he has brought among us a foreigner to laugh at us. It's a kind of a disparaging reference. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. And I'm just kind of curious about this word laugh. I think I've seen it before. I just want to see if it's the same one I'm thinking of. To make sport of me, sahak. So I want to see if it's been used before. Let's see, we see Abraham, Sarah. I'm looking for Isaac here. Lot, Abimelech, here we go. So there was an incident. Isaac was following in his father Abraham's footsteps. Abraham, coming into the land of Canaan, knew this was a region where the people did not serve God the way that Abraham did. And since they did not fear God, Abraham figured that they might see Abraham's lovely wife Sarah and might want to make her their own. And the way they would do that would be to murder Abraham and then take Sarah for themselves. So he asked Sarah, would you please say that you're my sister and not my wife? And that got Sarah into a bunch of trouble. There were a couple instances where that got her into trouble, but Isaac did not learn from the mistakes of his father Abraham. Maybe Abraham didn't convey to Isaac that these were mistakes, or maybe Isaac just didn't pick up on it. He, when he had Rebekah, his wife, he asked Rebekah to say, tell the people of the area that you're my sister and not my wife. Well, Abimelech was one of the people who had mistaken Sarah for just Abraham's sister and had taken her into his household to be his wife, and God had judged him for that because that was an immoral relationship. Of course, God was merciful to Abimelech because Abimelech had no idea that it was immoral. So Abimelech, by this point, by this story where this verse comes from, is kind of wise to this trick. So when he sees Isaac laughing, making sport with, I think there is a sense of intimacy in the way that that word could be used. It might be used as a euphemism here. We'll just have a peek at the context. Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I thought lest I die because of her. Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. And so Abimelech warns the populace. Isaac gets to stay, but he dodged a bullet. Isaac dodged a bullet in that situation. So I think that's the sense that Potiphar's wife is using here. She says, he came in to laugh at me. I think she's using a euphemism here. It's clear that she's not insinuating that Joseph merely laughed at her. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me. Why would he do that if he were only laughing? And fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. So I guess the keeper believes that Joseph doesn't deserve to be there. Why would you put a prisoner in charge of everybody? Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge. Sure sounds like Joseph has his trust, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So thankfully for Joseph, God's blessing still continues. But I imagine being Joseph, you're in prison falsely. You've done nothing wrong. You've done nothing to earn this treatment. And I imagine that would have been devastating to Joseph. And maybe you can tell things are going well for you for a prisoner. In terms of how the other prisoners are being treated, things are going well for you. But the problem is you're still in prison, right? So I'm imagining that Joseph could not have been happy about this situation, even if it was clear that God was blessing him. So let's continue to see what happened here. I think the events that come up, and probably if you've seen a movie or two, you know how these events go, but we'll see how the Bible portrays them. Joseph's in prison. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Hey, we know who that is. That's Potiphar, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. So that's interesting. This is Potiphar, who's the captain of the guard, and he's appointing Joseph to be over them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Now this is interesting because of what we know of Joseph before, I think in Genesis chapter 37. One of the reasons that Joseph's brothers, well, there were many reasons that Joseph's brothers didn't like him. One, Joseph was the first son of Jacob's or Israel's favored wife, Rachel. Rachel passed away giving birth to her second son, so Rachel was no longer alive, and Joseph had a favored place in his father's eyes because he was, the Bible says, because he was the son of Jacob's old age. So Jacob realizes he's up there in years. His wife Rachel has finally been able to give him a son after she's been barren all this time. And so Joseph is special to him in his old age, kind of a comfort to him in his old age. And so he made Joseph a coat of many colors. So it's back in that day and age, it was difficult to come by the materials you would need in order to dye clothing very brightly. So for him to give Joseph a coat of many colors implies that he's applying a lot of wealth to this gift of the coat to Joseph. That's really more of an aesthetic gift. Sure, the coat has some practical benefit, but those colors are not going to make the coat any more durable or any more suited to the environment. They're going to draw attention to Joseph and to the wealth that has been attributed to Joseph through this gift that Jacob has given him. So it's clear to everyone who looks at Joseph and who looks at him more than his brothers, it's clear to everyone that Joseph is the favored son. And then Joseph, one of the other things, Joseph gave a disfavorable report about a couple of his brothers. So that did not help him. And then, finally, the point. Joseph started having these dreams. He dreamed that he was out harvesting grain with his brothers. They had their sheaves of grain, the stalks that the grain would grow on. And he says that he dreamed that his grain stood upright, his sheaf stood upright, and all of his other brothers' sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to get the sense of that dream. Something about Joseph is special, and everyone else is going to bow down to Joseph. So he told everybody this dream, all his brothers this dream. They were not happy about that. And then he had another dream, had the gall to have another dream. And in this dream, I ought to find out exactly the sense of that dream, because I'm feeling a little bit less certain about the details of that. Basically, more of the same. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now, interestingly, he has 11 brothers. But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And I think your mother here, he's referring to Leah, his other wife, because Rachel was dead by this point. And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So we get a sense here, this is going to be significant details in the future. Now it's kind of coming around full circle. We have these officers who have this these dreams, and Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So here, I'll do my best to help. I'm not going to claim that I can interpret the dreams, but God can give me the interpretation of the dreams if he wants to. So let me know what you were dreaming. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes." So I'm not a vine vineyard owner, but this sounds like supernaturally fast growth here. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now, why he would think 3 days instead of 3 other periods of time, I think that was given to him by God. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. So I'm not in Egypt by just means. It's an injustice for me to be here. I'd like to go back home. And what's more, it's an injustice for me to be in this prison because I'm innocent of any wrongdoing. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. So not great news if these come true, so maybe they won't. Maybe he'll be fine. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them, which I think is odd also, that on this one day, you would expect Pharaoh to have one mood, probably a good mood, unless it's his party's not been going well. And that reminds me of the song, It's My Party, I Can Cry If I Want to. So you would expect him to be kind of one-minded. If he's going to draw attention to these servants, then he's going to treat them pretty similarly, you would think. But apparently he had an extra special grievance against the chief baker. He was willing to favor the cupbearer, but the chief baker gets hanged. Doesn't just get to rot in prison, he gets hanged. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So I imagine Joseph, after 3 days, he sees them going and he goes, I told the cupbearer to remember me. I'm going to get out of here anytime. I'll be able to go home, and then everything will be fine. And then I'll have to deal with my brothers, but everything will be fine. After that, I can finally return home, and I don't have to be here in Egypt anymore, and I don't have to be in prison anymore, and I don't have to be treated like a criminal when I'm not anymore. And the days continue on. And they become weeks, and they become months. And I think eventually Joseph would realize what has happened. So next chapter, we're making a lot of progress today. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind. So if you're looking at a map of Israel, to the west is going to be the Mediterranean Sea. You would expect that wind to be humid and probably to be carrying rain with it. Over to the east is the Arabian Peninsula, where Saudi Arabia is. That's a lot of desert, not a lot of water. So you'd expect wind from the east to be hot, not conducive. It would be dry, not conducive to growing good crops. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. And if you haven't known the story before, maybe I think looking at this, I would be at a loss too. Clearly, there's something similar here. We've got 7, 7, and 7. So there's a pattern here. There's 7 good and then 7 bad. 7 good that's swallowed up by something bad, and it happens in both the dreams. So what is it? What's on Pharaoh's mind that he keeps dreaming this pattern, or is there some significance to this? Is there some supernatural importance to this? And I can see why he's calling on his magicians and wise men to try to sort this out. But what possibly, I mean, there's something good going to be eaten up by something bad. If you're at least getting that sense, who knows if it's past, who knows if it's future, it doesn't sound good. I can see why Pharaoh would be troubled. But I think from just this information, if I were not already aware of how the story goes, I would be at a loss to understand why this pattern that's apparently important enough to be repeated and on Pharaoh's mind, what that pattern would mean. So his magicians can't interpret this for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, so Pharaoh would probably understand this is Potiphar's jurisdiction here. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about, I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. So Joseph probably hadn't had a chance to clean up in a while in prison. Now he gets his chance, comes before Pharaoh presentable. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And I like to check these footnotes. Apparently, a couple translations of the Bible would say, without God, it is not possible to give Pharaoh an answer about his welfare. So either way, Joseph knows where his ability comes from, which is a lot to Joseph's credit, because if we look at his 10 older brothers, I'm not seeing a lot to their credit. The first 4 brothers especially seemed to have their own issues. Reuben, the oldest, laid with one of Jacob's concubines. That was sexual immorality. Of course, we know Judah also had sexual immorality. Judah also encouraged the brothers to sell Joseph off to Egypt. Judah was the 4th oldest son. The 2nd and 3rd sons were Simeon and Levi, and they put the city of Shechem to death. I kind of alluded to that earlier. The prince of Shechem, who the city was named after, his name actually was Shechem. He did do wrong. He raped Dinah, who was the daughter of Jacob. She was the sister of Joseph and his brothers. So definitely that was wrong. But he also sought to marry her. So he was making reconciliation for this act. And yet, instead of accepting the reconciliation, Simeon and Levi deceived the entire city into a state of weakness. You can read more about that in earlier in Genesis, and the actual chapter slips my mind. I did cover it in one of the previous videos in the series, so there's a playlist about my Genesis study, and so you can check the playlist. I'm sure a title will be able to tell you which chapter you want to be reading, or you can listen to the video if you care to. So Simeon and Levi tricked the city into a position of weakness and then put the entire city to death for the sin of one man. And the other brothers joined in looting the city. So these were the 4 older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Not great influences at all. Bad track record for the family. Of course, the other 6 brothers who were older than Joseph were all complicit in sending Joseph off to Egypt. They were all in on this conspiracy. So Joseph does not have a lot of good role models, and I would think with 10 brothers who are all acting in this ungodly sense, you would kind of wonder about their upbringing, right? Jacob, I think, honors and respects God, but we've tended to see Jacob pursuing his own good ahead of seeking God, at least until the point where I think God made a point to Jacob that he had taken care of him, he had brought him back home, he had done everything that Jacob had asked, and Jacob had said, if you will take care of me and bring me back home to my family, then I will serve you. And so there was a point in Jacob's life where God's saying, where God brought Jacob back to the place where he made that promise and said, I have taken care of you, and I have brought you back. So from then on, Jacob became more committed to God. But I don't believe that Joseph's brothers were. So it's interesting to me that Joseph is willing to, unlike Reuben, unlike Judah, set aside the opportunity to lie with a woman. And Joseph, I think, I'm not sure that his brothers would have the strength of character here. Maybe that's why God's giving Joseph the dreams and not the brothers. Joseph will here say, I don't have the power to interpret dreams. God is the one who interprets dreams, and God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So he's putting all of his reliance on God, and I think that speaks well of Joseph. So then Pharaoh said to Joseph, and I'll read through this quickly because we've already heard this part. Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. So we get a little more information about how extremely ugly and thin these cows are. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears, and I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow it, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that this thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So I think, as we're hearing this account, I think it makes sense. The cows are a food product. They are produced through the agricultural system of Egypt, which I think it's common knowledge that Egypt had great agriculture because of the flooding, the regular flooding of the Nile River, so that tended to refresh the land and make the area alongside the Nile good for farming, and also it would have been good for pasture. So the cows are a food product. The corn is a food product. And by the way, this word corn that gets used here, and I just want to make sure, the ears that get used here, I want to say if it's been ears in this version, I think I've seen corn in the King James version, but this would not be the corn that we're familiar with in North America. That's the image that I get in my mind because I've driven by cornfields in North America, and so I've seen these ears of corn on stalks in North America, and often when I've seen an animated version, at least one animated version of this story, and in the animated version, it would have shown ears of corn also in that story. But from what I understand, the corn that we're familiar with in North America is it's a version of maize that would not have been available to Joseph in his region. And the King James Version, like I'm saying, I believe that would have been where I would have seen the word corn. I better check on this. Okay, that one it uses ears too, so I don't know if there's corn in a different version. Probably looking at the word ears, I get that sense, but this word ears, I think, also would apply to grains that we would associate with being of the kind like wheat or barley, and these kinds of grains would have been local to Joseph's area. So I don't know what specific grain that Pharaoh saw in his dream, but I doubt it's corn such as we have here in North America. So let's see. Anyway, these the cattle, the ears, food products for the region. So if there is a good that is going to be consumed by a bad, if these things are food products, then the good food is going to be consumed by blight, by the east wind, by emptiness. So once we hear the explanation, I think the explanation is common sense, but there is no way that someone could have gotten to the proper explanation except that God supernaturally gave Joseph the proper answer, that this is 7 years, as opposed to, say, 7 days. Why is it 7 years in this dream and not like the cupbearer and the baker 3 days? Because God supernaturally told Joseph which time frame it was. So Joseph knows a thing or two about stewardship, about taking care of property. So he's got some advice for Pharaoh. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years. By the way, what's this? Or over the land and organize the land. Okay. So these footnotes often have something to do with how the underlying Hebrew language works. So that may have been a sense of the translation that we don't get the way that this text presents it to us. So let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the spirit of God," or of the gods, because Pharaoh would have been polytheistic, but he's getting a sense, this man Joseph can do what my magicians could not do. Surely there is a supernatural spirit within this man Joseph, who, by the way, said that God would give him the interpretation of the dream. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command." Can you imagine taking a guy out of prison and saying, "You're second in command now. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. or as according to your and according to your command, all of my people shall kiss the ground. So that's interesting. It makes me wonder about the Hebrew layout, but I don't think I can understand it better than that footnote might suggest. So I'm going to leave that there. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. So he's basically setting Joseph up as his equal, except regarding the throne. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. So they actually tell us which word that was, a brick. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. I guess that Potiphera name is pretty popular around there. By the way, I've kind of thought that this word On might be a deity, and I recently had a look at it and proved myself wrong. On would have been a city in Egypt. So Potiphera was the priest of a city region. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He was 17, by the way, when he was sold into slavery. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. So Manasseh sounds like the Hebrew for making to forget. And then the name of the second son, he called Ephraim, or probably more like Ephraim. This word im in the Hebrew language refers to a plural, so Ephraim. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Ephraim sounds like Hebrew for making fruitful. I was also looking at the original Hebrew for this one. I was especially curious about Ephraim because it winds up being a significant tribe in Israel. The word I was seeing, double fruit. Okay, I saw something about double ash heap. I shall be doubly fruitful. What I was seeing here was this word again, double land, twin land. And I was considering perhaps he was talking about the land, his father's land, but now also he is fruitful in the land of Egypt. So I'm not sure the full sense, but clearly he is abounding to the sense that Ephraim has a pluralized name, doubly fruitful. The 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an I don't know what's in my throat here, but the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, there was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And I remember I've got water down here, just a moment. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph ordered all the storehouses, all that was in them, and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So, guess what? Who also lives in all the earth? Joseph's father and his 11 brothers also live somewhere in all the earth. So we've got some foreshadowing there. We're going to end the study here for this video. But I did want to point out the reason I wanted to cover all of this distance. Clearly, Joseph was in a bad situation. He had been with his father and his brothers, as he ought to have been, up until his brothers sold him to Egypt. And so I'm pretty sure that would have been very depressing. It's an understatement. And I'm sure he was constantly longing to be back in the land he was familiar with, be back in his homeland, be back where his native language was spoken. He probably had to learn Egyptian. In fact, I know he had to learn Egyptian based on what the Bible tells us later on. I'm sure that he was homesick for this place that he had been torn away from, and definitely saw that he was unjustly treated. He was a victim in this situation, but he was also faithful, and God blessed his faithfulness. Surely all the blessing that God had for Joseph would have been worthless if Joseph hadn't actually been working and doing a diligent job for his master. Regardless of the fact that Joseph was a slave, Joseph was also applying himself. He was industrious. By the way, I've heard that industry is one of the values that is attributed to Westerners nowadays, especially white people. So like me, like my skin color, there are people who say, well, industry is not a common national, international value. It belongs to you white people. That's your white people value. So when you're trying to tell other people that the way they can do better, the way that they can get ahead in life is to be industrious, you're foisting your white person values on the other people, on all the brown people that make up the majority of the world, and you shouldn't do that. That's colonization. But in this example, we have Joseph, who is Hebrew. He is from beyond. He doesn't come from the Caucasian region. He comes from, his ancestors come from, or at least his extended family comes from the region of Aram. He's an Aramean. He was coming from the Middle Eastern region, so he would have been brown-skinned. And he is in the presence of the Egyptians. His master, Potiphar, was an Egyptian, so he would have been African. Likewise with Pharaoh and the jailer in Potiphar's jail. And so we see Joseph is applying industry to his situation, and everything that he is working on is benefiting because God is blessing him. If he had not been hard at work, if he had been lazy, then I'm sure Potiphar would not have promoted him to the head of Potiphar's house, to be equal with Potiphar himself. So this does not seem like a Western or white value. This seems like a universal value. So Joseph is faithful. He's industrious. He doesn't fool around with his master's wife, and yet even so, he gets thrown into prison. So for one thing, he's living basically in exile and in slavery away from his homeland. Sure would like to get back there. And then he gets exiled again from his master's house, where he's been doing very well. He gets thrown into prison. So even more unjust against Joseph. And yet apparently he still maintains his values. He's still industrious in prison. The jailer is willing to trust him to manage all of the other prisoners. And I'm sure there are actually legitimate criminals in that prison too. So Joseph no doubt has to use some wisdom and possibly apply his strength to making sure that everything is safe and taken care of. In the King James Version, it tells us that he was to serve these two officials of Pharaoh. So I'm going to bring that up real quick. So here we are talking about the cupbearer and the baker, and the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with him. So in the King James Version, the way that, I want this tab, the way that it puts it is the captain of the guard charged Joseph with him, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. So they continued for some time in custody. So in the ESV, it may not be as apparent, but it says he attended them. So Joseph is, even for the other prisoners, he is seeing himself in terms of a servant, even as those who over him keep elevating him to positions equal with themselves. He's making life really easy for his master and the jailer and Pharaoh. These guys don't have to concern themselves with anything. They get to keep their title, and Joseph gets to do all the work. But Joseph is willing to do that. And so he gets blessed with the leadership of the, of Potiphar's house. Let's see, I want to go here. Gets blessed with the leadership of Potiphar's house, gets blessed with the leadership of the prison, and eventually gets blessed with the leadership of the nation of Egypt. But nevertheless, I'm sure in Potiphar's house, he would have traded his elevated status in Potiphar's house just to be able to go back home to his father and even his brothers. Maybe he would have been more cautious around his brothers from that point on. But from what I can tell here, especially the names that he gives his sons, which harken back to where he came from, to his homeland, saying that God has made him forget his affliction, and that God has blessed him with abundance in a foreign land. I think Joseph's heart is still attached to the land that he came from. And I expect in Potiphar's house, he would have gladly given up being in charge of Potiphar's house to go back to his land. And in the jail, I'm sure he would have given up his place in charge of the jail to go back to his land. Now he's here with Pharaoh, and he gets to be second in command over all of Egypt. And so definitely he sees that he's needed in this position, and I think it probably would have been hard at that point to say, no, I'd give up the entirety of Egypt to go back to my land. But I think that I with the names of his sons, I think he's still regarding his land fondly. He would rather that he was not made to suffer in a foreign land, but God has blessed him. God has given him purpose in this land. It's up to him to save not just Egypt, but the entire world from the effects of this famine. So consider if Joseph had never been sold as a slave to Egypt, what would have happened? Pharaoh would have had this dream about the cows and about the grain, and no one would have been able to tell Pharaoh what this dream was about. And then 7 years later, after a period of great wealth, when everyone is satisfied with the increase of the crops, okay, we finally figured out this agriculture thing, we'll never starve again. Then comes the 7 years of famine, and everything would have been wiped out. But because God allowed Joseph to be sold as a slave to Egypt, in Egypt, because God allowed Joseph to be held in the jail where Joseph could meet the cupbearer, then Joseph was available to be able to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and also had the skills from working with Potiphar to be able to control the food regulation for Egypt. So we're going to see later on, not in this video, we're going to be wrapping up this video in a bit, but we're going to be seeing later on that Joseph actually recognizes what his brothers meant for evil. I'm quoting, what his brothers meant for evil, God meant for good. And the awful things that happened to him were actually done to position him for where God needed him to be and what God needed him to do. So I think that's encouraging. That's something that I try to keep in mind. Later on in the Bible, in the New Testament, we're told that God works all things for the good of those who love God and who are called according to God's purpose. So, but often it doesn't feel that way. I've had a couple sad occasions here in our family, and there, when we face these hardships, it's easy even for us Christians to say, God, do you have something against me? Is there, why are you making it hurt? I thought that you loved me. I thought that everything was going to work for good. Why am I suffering right now? And so we see in a story like this about Joseph that sometimes God blessed Joseph. God was apparently favorable toward Joseph, but God allowed Joseph to suffer for a time, so that God could save the entire rest of the world. And I've heard that Joseph is, I don't know how accurate it is, but I've heard Joseph compared to Jesus as what's called a type. You look at some people in the Bible clearly says that Isaac, Abraham's son, was a type of Jesus Christ. It was kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, because God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and then God spared Isaac by providing a lamb instead. So that becomes an image of what Jesus was going to be. With Joseph, we kind of see another type of Jesus, in the sense that Joseph was made to suffer unjustly. Joseph did not earn the slavery that he suffered. He did not earn the prison sentence, and yet his suffering was necessary to save the entire world from this natural disaster, this famine. And of course, I recognize the sense of the entire world coming to Egypt. We can question what's meant by the entire world. I doubt that the Native Americans were traveling all the way to Egypt across the ocean. I doubt that they were affected by the flood. I think what's referred to in the passage is the world known to that area, the world known to Egypt. Now, I've got to be careful here, because I am a human who doesn't have all of the information about the scenario, so I'm just using the best of my human understanding. The Bible is the Word of God, written with the words that God gave the original penman. In this case, it would have been Moses, so who, by the way, was brought up with the history of Egypt. Go figure. I don't want to elevate my understanding above what the Bible says. So I'm going to say my interpretation of the statement that the world was coming to Joseph would be, okay, it's the world known to Egypt at the time, or the world that had access to Egypt at the time. It wouldn't be the entire globe. I've got to recognize I could be totally wrong about that. There are a lot of times where common sense is not actually what truly happens. There are a lot there's the phrase, truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes that phrase actually pans out. So anyway, I jumped a rabbit trail. I was saying that Joseph is a type of Christ. Just like Joseph, Jesus came to earth through no fault of his own. Did he come to earth, lived a human life, which we know the human life is full of suffering. I'm remembering when the Bible tells us that Jesus wept because his friend Lazarus had passed away. So Jesus not only suffered the normal human life, but he also was crucified. That was a punishment for a severe criminal. It was a severe punishment for grave criminals. And Jesus had done nothing wrong. Jesus didn't even say that he was going to try to usurp Rome, which that was why he was crucified, because the Roman authorities thought that heard the Jews were smearing Jesus' name essentially, and telling the Roman authorities that Jesus was I'm trying to think of the proper word. That he was going to betray Rome, that he was going to rebel against Rome, going to lead a rebellion. That was not anything that Jesus ever promised to do. So Jesus was suffered unjustly. He was crucified. He died unjustly, a criminal's death. But if he had not suffered and died, then he could not rise again from the dead, and he could not take our sins, having paid the punishment of paid the punishment of the criminal. Jesus served the sentence that we were due, and as the infinite Son of God, he was the only one who could serve that sentence and pay for our sins. Even we are not strong enough to pay the penalty that we deserve for rebelling against God, which we do throughout our lives. You may see yourself as a pretty good person, but when we look at ourselves according to the standard of Scripture, it becomes clear that we rebel against God in many ways. His law is good. It's perfect, but it's also beyond us. It's not something that us humans can do, which means that we are not good, and we're beyond just flawed. We are in rebellion. A lot of the times the sins that we commit, we're saying, I know better than this. I know in my heart, with the conscience that God gave me, that this is not what I ought to be doing. Even if you don't believe in God, I'm sure you have situations where you're saying, I know it's not what I ought to be doing, but it's just more convenient, and I can give myself reasons for why it's okay. I'm not sinning. There's nothing wrong with this, and yet even a sin that looks small to us is a sin against an infinite God who is sovereign over us and is innocent of any wrongdoing. And so all of the guilt of that sin against an infinite God, so it's an infinite sin, then comes back on our heads and our shoulders. So only the Son of God, who also shared God's divine, I've used the word infinite too many times, limitlessness. Jesus, like God, is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and he took on human form so that he could bear the punishment, but he carries God's divine qualities, and so he can bear the infinite punishment that we deserved, but only because he came and suffered this unjust suffering that we inflicted on him. Now, the difference between Jesus and Joseph is that Jesus chose to come to earth and suffer and die so that he could rise again and save us from our sins. Joseph did not choose. He was forced into this situation unjustly because God had a plan for him to save those around him. So I'm done for tonight, and we'll be back next week. I don't expect any interruptions to keep me from coming back next week, and we'll continue to learn more about Joseph and what happened to his family during the famine. God bless you.